Business. Today with me, Ronah, Nahabwe, with Winnie and Naka, in the sign language interpretation. Now, moving on with the economic disruptions from South Sudan wars. The civil war in South Sudan began, but since then, the fighting has contributed a humanitarian crisis with disastrous social and economic repercussions. The current conflict has caused a real GDP decline of more than 5% annually over the past 5 years, and South Sudan is currently one of the world's poorest countries, coming to 186 out of 189. Samuel Chiyomonda compiled this report, and let's have a look.
Thousands of Sudanese have started evacuating from Khartoum and Omdurman because of concern that the rival camps will intensify their all-out struggle for dominance once evacuations are complete. Routes to the Egyptian border crossing have become more expensive for travelers, and prices of food and water have frequently doubled. Fuel prices have also surged to $67 per gallon from $4.2, and drivers have raised their fares. Speaking to reporters at the Uganda Media Center in Kampala, Ugandan government spokesperson Ofono Pondo said that President Museveni has ordered that all Ugandans in South Sudan be evacuated and brought back home.
Sudan erupted into conflict about 10 days ago. Internal fight between the military and the militia, which was originally allied to the government there, the Rapid Support Forces. As a result of that fight, especially concentrated in Khartoum, many people are finding it difficult to survive, to live, and to move out. Consequently, a number of countries have taken a decision to evacuate their nationals and allies. In the same vein, the government of Uganda, by the directive of the President of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, made 7 days ago that Ugandans should be evacuated from Sudan.
President Museveni has warned Sudanese of the perils of ideologies and errors in connection to tribalism, religion, superiority, which are the source of the current civil war before the hostilities started in South Sudan. Ugandan exports, both formal and informal, have negatively been impacted by the civil war. The latter was struck significantly harder. In comparison to trade flows that were not impacted by the conflict, exports to South Sudan have decreased by around 12%, while informal exports to South Sudan have decreased by almost 80%. When this is converted to monetary values, Uganda's entire informal exports have been cut by a startling 25%, while the country's total formal exports have decreased by about 2% as a result of the conflict.
For calling this emergency meeting of the IGAD heads of state. When I last visited Khartoum, and in all the other meetings before, Naivasha and so on, I always told the Sudanese about the dangers of ideological and strategic mistakes. We used to discuss with the General Bashir the dangers of encouraging the ideology and the politics of identity, of tribes, identity of race, Arabs, Africans, identity of religion, Muslim, Christian. And I used to tell General Bashir that this is very dangerous for that country. And indeed, eventually the country broke up into north and south. Now within the north, you still see some of these problems. So therefore, it is not correct to go on papering over mistakes.
In addition to its impact on South Sudan itself, the crisis is likely to have impacted the country's neighbors. Ample anecdotal evidence suggests that the crisis had economic consequences for the rest of East African community through channels like refugee flows, increased military spending and deployment, as well as trade disruptions. Samuel Chirumunda, Masika Sime for Smart 24 TV, Business Today.
Business Today, let's look at the prudent debt management. Now, economists and civil society organizations have called for prudent debt management, the strategies and comprehensive revision of government policies to get rid of wasteful expenditures. They have raised an alarm at a time when Uganda's debt portfolio has tremendously risen to 79.9 trillion on the nominal value. Uganda has currently been ranking among the moderate risk debt distress countries in sub-Saharan region, as Uganda's debt portfolio has tremendously risen to approximately 80 trillion shillings on nominal value. The technical talk targeting policymakers, civil society organizations and economists had a dialogue to understand debt sustainability across the East African region, the legal frameworks, policies, strategies, interlinkages between debt, tax, social, economic and other physical related issues towards attaining prudent debt management. Parliament has on several occasions asked government to develop mechanisms that will ensure the country returns to a low-risk debt distress. Yasin Mayanja, a principal economist, notes that they have been working hard to ensure that there is an increase in revenue because Ministry of Finance learned that the most expensive money is the one that can be disbursed easily, highlighting the debt service as a share of revenue.
So here we see the different countries and where they fall. Again, this is sub-Saharan Africa, so low risk, none, moderate risk, that is where the majority of countries are, including DRC, Rwanda, Tanzania and Uganda. Then high risk of debt distress, here we see Burundi, we see Kenya and we see South Sudan.
Delivering a paper on how sustainable Uganda's public debt is, senior economist Fred Muhumuza called for revision of government's policies to get rid of wasteful expenditure while restructuring the type of loans that are got from IMF and World Bank.
Once you don't get those right, debt is always around the corner and you can always slip back. So you really need to see what have we been borrowing for, how have we been utilizing the money that we borrow. That is within our ability to resolve. Yasin talked about the large government and so many things really that we spend money on. It's not just the large government. If you look at the budget of Parliament alone, we know over 800 billion. That means we are spending over 2 billion per day on Parliament alone. So if you started there, you want to say, should we or should we not? And you can go around all different institutions, you find the same story in all those. And this is borrowed money, not really our own money.
He further advises on how best to assess the debt, as debt to GDP ratio was referred to as a structure that doesn't envisage the real problem.
You have a 10-year bond, you have a 3-year bond. You even have 3 months in the treasury bills. We never look at them as debt. But it's literally money the private sector has given you for a fee. Now, a 90-day treasury bill can be at 9%. Meaning every 3 months, you must pay 9% to these individuals. Now that's a cost you want to avoid. You get to Japan, their debt is 264% of their GDP, but it is at 0.6%, not 16, 18% for Uganda. But also Japan, the debt is owned by the nationals, the debt is owned by their central bank. So even when they pay, they are paying their own nationals. It's not a leakage out of the economy. So we need new parameters of understanding where are we in terms of debt. The other main thing is debt sits in the future. So it's a futuristic variable. Your trouble with debt is sitting in your future.
Debt accrued by countries is sustainable. For us, is not very feasible. One, because it looks at debt to GDP ratio is being used by all countries, both the developed and developing countries. And for us, what we think is that there is definitely need to put into consideration other factors, such as the structure of the debt that's being accrued, in terms of how much it costs the countries, because we see that for developing countries the cost of debt is quite high. We tend to pay very high interest rates as opposed to the developed countries.
On the other hand, George Odong drives the focus of the audience to the public debt ignorance per capita, as most Ugandans don't even know the burden of public debt, yet it is from them that the revenue is collected.
It's something that we talk about in our boardrooms, but we are saying the public has a right to know, because debt servicing is largely from taxes, and it is us, the citizens, who pay those taxes. So we have a right to know what our debt situation is.
Whereas multilateral lenders remain the largest source of Uganda's credit, the share of loans from China and commercial banks have been ranked quite high, as World Bank and IMF contributes the most. The report also lists China and commercial banks as some of the largest sources of Uganda's external credit. Policymakers, MPs at the national and regional levels have a role to play towards following up on the implementation of the EMU protocol, while looking at issues like transparency, accountability of debt, since many African countries have limited access to resources to reinvest in their economies, resulting into persistent debt crisis. Therefore, we must identify viable solutions to get out of this debt trap. Ronah, Nahabwe, Smart 24 TV, Business Today. Now, China's increasing reliance on discounted crude oil from Russia as the smaller independent processors face a shortage due to the EU and the G7 embargo, a price cap. This has forced them to turn to Iran's cheap oil, leaving China's largest state-owned private refineries to dominate the market.
The EU, G7, Australia and other allies banned the maritime transportation services from shipping Russia's crude oil to third countries if the oil is bought above the price cap of 60 euros per barrel. However, China is not following the price cap policy and is taking advantage of discounted Russian crude. Despite initial hesitancy, large Chinese refiners, both state-controlled and private, have resumed imports of Russian crude and are now the key crude export outlet for Russia. During the period of hesitation, the smaller independent refiners gobbled up Russia's export grade exported from Far East Russian ports. Russia began to divert its oil product cargoes to North Africa and Asia, while Europe ramped up imports of diesel from the Middle East and Asia to offset the loss of Russian barrels, of which it imported around 600,000 barrels per day before April embargo took effect. At least 3 cargoes carrying 190 tons of diesel loaded in the Russian Baltic port of Barymosk in April were handed to deliver the fuel to Saudi Arabia. The Saudis could export part of the Russian diesel to other countries after refining. Europe was on track to import the highest volumes of diesel from Middle East and Asia in 7 years as EU turned to alternative supply after the ban on Russian imports. Just after fuel embargo, Europe was buying more diesel from the United States and Saudi Arabia, yet Europe still remained the biggest buyer of Russian diesel in January.
That now leads us to the business today, but before we do that, let's look at what made the headlines.
In Business Today, members of parliament have demanded the government make proper and clear budget to have all city roads rehabilitated but not patched. The Ministry of Finance has encouraged Ugandans to engage in manufacturing sector in order to balance the trade deficit between Tanzania and Uganda. And traders have appealed to the government to give them tax waivers so that they can give their products from Mombasa following the flash floods in Mombasa.
And that's all we had for you today on Business Today. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Ronah Nahabwe with Winnie Wiinza Nakauch on the sign language interpretation. If you missed any of these stories, you could watch on our YouTube channel at Smart 24 TV Live and follow on our social media platforms at Smart 24 TV on Twitter, Facebook, and the like. Have a lovely evening.